So this is half of the sermon that I split, okay? So hang in. So in a moment, we're going to enter into a section of the prayer that includes this phrase I want to lift up before we get to it. The phrase is kol dmama daka. The other day, I was dictating into my phone of some of these words for this, writing I was doing. And, Siri doesn't speak Hebrew. So I said, cold mama daka, and it said, cold mama da. It's not cold mama. It's kol, voice, mama, which is like quiet, daka, it's almost like thin. It's usually translated the still, small voice, which the grand Unatana Tokef prayer will shortly claim can be heard today, on this sacred day. The phrase comes from a very particular and very juicy story that teaches something important about the sacred work of this season. The story begins with Elijah the prophet, Eliyahu Hanavi in Hebrew, one of the greatest prophets of all time. His connection to God was so strong, it gave him the very power to bring life back to the dead. We think of Elijah every time we leave that extra glass of wine at the Seder table, or invite him in during celebrations of new babies, every time we sing Eliyahu Hanavi at the end of Shabbat and holidays, evoking him as the messenger of the coming Messianic age, a time when all human-caused suffering shall cease. Yet, even Eliyahu Hanavi had trouble listening to the voice of God. In chapter 18 of the first book of Kings, Eliyahu confronts evil King Ahab and Queen Jezebel and their 450 Baal-worshipping priests on Mount Carmel. After a sacrificial showdown, Eliyahu wins, and then mercilessly chases down all of the idolatrous priests and kills every last one of them. From there, he flees, wanders for 40 days without food, and ends up on Mount Horeb, otherwise known as Mount Sinai. He goes into a cave where the word of God comes to him saying, Ma lecha po, Eliyahu? What are you doing here, Elijah? It's a lot like God's question in the Garden of Eden after Adam and Eve's apple incident. Ayeka, God asks, where are you? In both cases, surely God knows the answer. Where are you, Ayeka? What are you doing here, Ma lecha po? God does not ask these kinds of questions in order to discover new information. God asks these kinds of questions for the sake of the one who is asked, for the sake of inspiring reflection, and usually when that person is heading down the wrong path. So God asks Eliyahu, Ma lecha po? What are you doing here? And Eliyahu says, Kano kaneti l'Adonai Elohei tzvaot. I am moved by a zeal for Adonai, Lord of hosts. For the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and have put your prophets to the sword. I alone am left, and they are out to take my life. Good story. Come out, God replies, and stand on the mountain before the Lord. And then Adonai passes by. A great and mighty wind rushes by, splitting mountains, shattering rocks. But God is not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But God is not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But God is not in the fire, so says the book of Kings. And after the fire, a kol demama daka, a still small voice. At this, Eliyahu wraps his mantle about him and goes to the entrance of the cave. And God asks him again, Ma lecha po, Eliyahu? Why are you here? Eliyahu replies, Kano kaneti l'Adonai Elohei tzvaot. I am moved by a zeal for Adonai, Lord of hosts. For the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and have put your prophets to the sword. I alone am left, and they are out to take my life. Identical quote. It seems that our dear friend remains unchanged by his experience on the mountain. He answers God's question with the exact same words as before. Kano, kaneti, I am full of zeal. So, God responds, Lech, go, shuv ledarkecha, return the way that you have come. And then he instructs him to anoint a successor, the prophet Elisha. 19th century commentator known as the Malbim considers this to be God's way of removing Eliyahu from prophetic practice because he was way too attached to his zeal. If this direct encounter could not teach him to carry out his prophecy with a gentler touch, then it was time for him to retire and become the wandering spirit that we sing for at our Seder tables. Such is the story evoked by that one phrase we're about to find in our prayers in the High Holy Day liturgy. So there's a lot of choreography and drama on the High Holy Days. Maybe there's no earth-shattering wind and fire, but still we have the shofar, we have fasting, this music, we have this prostration coming up. This story and its appearance in our liturgy suggests that in all of that drama, the most important way to encounter the voice of God may be still in the humble act of listening and letting ourselves be guided by a quieter wisdom, something even the great prophet Elijah could not do. Listening is hard. And I wonder what makes it hard to hear that cold mama daka. I think of all the noise and daily life that can cover up that quiet wisdom inside, the seductions of the smartphone, the onslaught of notifications, the 24/7 news, the rushing from place to place, the spin of the mind worrying about the future, replaying the past. So much to distract, especially when that quiet voice is saying something I don't particularly want to hear. And that's where I think Eliyahu went wrong. It seems on one level he understands God is not to be heard in the fire and the earthquakes. Eliyahu hears the still small voice and wraps himself in his mantle. He knows enough to know that God is in the quiet stillness, but even though he passes that first test, the question is, why does he remain unchanged from his encounter? Eliyahu may understand that God is in the still small voice, but he is still deafened by his own fervor, his certainty that he alone is right. I am moved by a zeal for God, he says. The Israelites have forsaken your covenant, and I alone am left. This is the man who killed 450 Baal worshippers. When God asks him what he's doing here, he might have allowed himself to feel some small level of remorse, even if he still would have done the same thing if he had the chance again. He might have asked for forgiveness. He might have wondered if his zeal was the proper response to a God who speaks with such a soft and subtle voice. Instead, he justifies himself with his old and unchanged story. Like religious extremists in our day, Eliyahu was absolutely certain and zealous, yet ironically, his very zeal stopped him from hearing God's lesson on that mountaintop. Eliyahu became attached to his narrative. I am God's lonely warrior. No one else cares about the true God. I am special because I see what no one else sees. God needs me to fight for him, even unto the death against those heathens. That story was strong enough to withstand 40 days of fasting and a revelation on Mount Sinai. It makes me wonder about our own stories and how hard they are to break down. Armoring ourselves with habitual convictions and rigid ideas of who we are and how the world works, we deaden our sensitivity to the voice of conscience and wisdom within. Deep listening can be transformative, calling into question all of our stories about ourselves, for better or for worse, and that can be terrifying. If it was hard for Elijah the prophet, no wonder it can be hard for us. So today, and through the 10 sacred days of awe ahead, I want to wish us all the strength and courage to listen deeply for the still small voice beneath our habitual stories. May we have the humility to let ourselves hear the kol d'mama daka, even when it challenges us. And may we be blessed in this season to do what Elijah could not, to let that voice teach us to change ourselves and the world for the better. Shana Tova. As promised, I want to give us a little bit of introduction to this piece of Torah, and I think you'll see why this is the second part of the same teaching I started earlier. So I have to warn you that the passage we're about to read isn't easy. If you came here for a morally uncomplicated, just sort of blissed out experience, you might be disappointed. The story of Abraham's near sacrifice of Isaac, known traditionally as the Akedah, the binding, has bothered generations, leading to libraries of commentary in Jewish circles and beyond. And I consider it to be one of the most challenging passages in all of Torah. The story begins in chapter 22 of Genesis when God tests Abraham. Take your son, your only son, your beloved Isaac, and offer him up as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you. So Abraham, the same Abraham who had earlier protested to God for the sake of the sinful residents of Sodom and Gomorrah, that same Abraham silently rises up early the next day and gets on the road with Isaac, 2 servants, and a load of wood. On the third day, Abraham and Isaac leave the servants and the donkey behind and go up the mountain together with the wood. And Isaac asks, "Here are the firebrand and the wood for the sacrifice, but where is the lamb?" And Abraham says, "God will see to the lamb, my son." They arrive at the place, and Abraham builds the altar, arranges the wood, binds Isaac on top of it. He stretches out his hand and takes up the knife to slaughter his son. We're going to stop there. So most Jewish commentary and rabbinic sources say that Abraham proves his greatness in this frightening tale because he is willing to sacrifice that which is most dear to him. The text itself supports this reading as the voice of God affirms after the whole drama has concluded, "Now I know that you fear God, for you have not withheld your son." For years, I have rebelled against a straightforward read of this story. What kind of a God would demand a parent kill their child? What kind of a God would even pretend to want such a thing to test someone, dragging Abraham, Isaac, and Sarah through such deep trauma? And then what kind of religion would bequeath this story to generations afterwards as a sacred text? As a mother, I recoil in horror. And I say to you now that if you ever hear me say that I hear the voice of God telling me to kill my son, lock me away, please. This year, as I try to imagine what kind of religious fervor could lead Abraham to bind his son and lift the knife, I find all too many examples in our world. You don't need to look far to find headlines of zealots willing to die or even to kill for their religious or political beliefs or for darker, stranger delusions. It would be far more comfortable to think that such fanaticism exists only outside the fold of my own people. But in this season of repentance, I must force myself to reckon with the reality that Jews are not immune from religious extremism. Progressives are not immune from anti-Semitism. Americans are not immune from fascism. Even some of my favorite peace-loving B'nai Havurah members have joked that some dark part of them wishes certain assassination attempts had not failed. As Rabbi Richard Hirsch writes in the Reconstructionist Machzor commentary on this passage, there are dark impulses of aggression within each of us, dormant perhaps, under control, we hope, but always ready to be released. Yes, even good people like us, like Abraham, have the potential to commit or to condone violence, especially when we're afraid. And these days, there's a lot to fear. But Abraham doesn't kill his son. He binds Isaac on the altar. He sends out his hand and lifts the knife, but then an angel calls out to him, "Avraham, Avraham!" The Netziv of Volozhin tells us Abraham was so intent on his violence that he didn't hear the angel's first call. But then, before the knife comes down, the second call penetrates his violent reverie, and just in time, Abraham pauses and answers, "Hineni," here I am. And the angel tells him, "Do not lay a hand on the boy." Abraham looks up and sees a ram caught in a bush, which he sacrifices in place of his son. And I wonder, what if Abraham's greatness lay not in his willingness to obey what he thought was God's horrifying demand, but in his ability to stop himself? What if Abraham's greatness was in hearing that deeper, quieter call and being open to seeing a different solution? What if he passed his test not through his obedience to a call for violence, but because in the end, he stopped? How did Abraham stop? It's a variation of a bigger question. How do we stop violence? It's the kind of question you could imagine coming out of the mouth of a particularly insightful kindergartner. Profound and almost impossible to answer with certainty. How do we stop violence? If we knew how to stop violence, child, there wouldn't be wars or mass shootings. So says my unthinking inner adult who no longer believes in peace or change. But maybe we do know deep down. Maybe there are answers right here in our own hearts, obscured by fear and pain and anger, distorted by righteous zeal of one flavor or another that dehumanizes others around us. What could happen if we could listen the way Abraham listened up on that mountain? Earlier this morning, we talked about that kol demama daka, the still small voice that Elijah heard. This same voice is what I think Abraham heard when the angel told him to stop. If Abraham had not been able to listen to that voice and let it change his understanding, none of us, descendants of Isaac, would be here today. One clever midrash, rabbinic interpretation, Bereshit Rabbah, the collection of rabbinic interpretations in midrash, explains that God's intention all along had never been that Abraham should kill Isaac. It was all a big misunderstanding. The teaching relies on a hyper-literal reading of the Hebrew term we usually translate as burnt offering or sacrifice. The root in Hebrew is olah, and you're going to hear it soon. Raising up. Looking back at God's command to offer him up as a burnt offering, v'ha'alehu, a hyper-literal reading would just be take him up. The Midrash imagines God explaining to Abraham, I didn't say kill him. I just said take him up. You took him up, now take him down. I love this Midrash for so many reasons. In a basic way, it gives me some comfort to imagine the whole sacrifice your son thing as a cosmic miscommunication, rather than a diabolical moral quandary. But in the context of what we've been talking about this morning, it's more than that. What if the angel was calling out to say, Abraham, you know how sure you were about what God wanted? Well, guess what? There is another way of thinking about it if you can just stop and listen long enough with an open mind. If you can just stay open, even if it challenges everything you think you know about how the world works. Read this way, Abraham's greatness was not only that he stopped, not only that he listened, but that he let his listening change his understanding of the world and his course of action. This is what Elijah the prophet missed up there on the mountain when he heard the kol demama daka, that still small voice. And I believe that this kind of listening may be part of the answer to that profound question, how do we stop violence? Over the past year of trauma and war and protest since October 7th, 2023, it has been so hard to hear our voices of inner wisdom and compassion. It has been nearly impossible to separate the trauma of this moment from awakened traumas of the past. The stakes are so high. The fear is so intense. We find ourselves swirling in storms of emotion that drown out any chance of hearing that kol demama daka, much less the voice of those who might see the conflict differently than we do. At B'nai, instead of spending our energy adding to the cacophony of statements in this past year, we decided to move through this time by practicing listening. With the leadership of our member Susan Kaplan and others, and sometimes in partnership with Temple Micah, We held a series of sessions aimed at teaching ourselves how to nurture our capacity to listen to one another, even when it's painful, even when there's deep disagreement and powerful passion. We've created a small Israel-Palestine working group who represent different perspectives in our community to be in ongoing dialogue with one another. And this group has guided decisions when B'nai has been asked to co-sponsor events and sign statements and promote programs and so on. It hasn't been perfect. Sometimes it's been frustrating. Sometimes it's been heartbreaking. Sometimes it's been inspiring. Sometimes we did more telling than listening. So far, we have yet to arrive at the solution to world peace. But we have learned, and we have found a way to stay in community and recognize common values, even when those values may not lead us all to the same conclusions about policy or politics. Our small experiment may not have brought peace to the Middle East yet, but in practicing listening and peacemaking in this way where we can, we are creating a rare kind of Jewish community in our day, one where your politics about Israel and Palestine are not a litmus test for belonging. Meanwhile, the practice of listening to the other builds our capacity to hear that still small internal voice as well, even when she's telling me something I don't want to hear. It's a lot of the same skills, recognizing our own defenses, noticing when we're triggered, seeking curiosity when we find ourselves upset, noticing, loosening our grip on our own stories of the world and ourselves. All of these skills can apply also to the quest for hearing that kol d'mama daka within. So I want to close with a few moments of practice together. I invite you to close your eyes if you have them open. I'm going to dare you to close them now. Find a comfortable position in your seat. Take a few moments to just listen to the room. If you find your mind wandering, notice the thoughts, let them pass. No need to push them away, simply bring your attention back to the sounds as they arise, gently. And now let's turn inward. If you could hear the voice of your own soul right now, what would that voice be saying? If you could hear beneath the distractions, beneath the defenses, beyond the stories you've so carefully constructed about yourself and the world, what would that still small voice be telling you right now? And whether or not that voice said something concise or clear, or whether you even were able to discern something verbal, I invite you to just try to take note of what it's been like to listen for that voice. And if you did receive something, take note of that as well. And when you're ready, take a few more moments and can open your eyes and return your attention to the room. Makor HaChaim, source of life, help us in this season to hear the voice of conscience, the voice of compassion, the voice of wisdom within. May we learn to lay down whatever stories we may cling to that keep us from tuning in to the deeper truth and that blind us from seeing solutions. May we, like Abraham, find the strength to stop, to listen, and to open ourselves to transformation. Amen.